It was a cold, rainy evening when a man, with a heart full of anger and indifference, dumped his senior dog by the side of the road. The old dog, frail and weary from years of loyal companionship, watched as the man drove away without a second glance, leaving it to fend for itself. But what the man didn't know was that this dog, despite its age and frailty, had one last trick up its sleeve. The dog limped away from the curb, its fur matted with rain, its eyes clouded with confusion and pain. How could the one creature who had always given him unconditional love be abandoned so heartlessly? The dog had been there through thick and thin, through every moment of happiness, and even the darkest times. And now it was left to face the world alone. But this was no ordinary dog. It had a spirit that wouldn't break. And deep within, there was a spark of something the man would never expect. The story you are about to hear isn't just about a dog abandoned on the street. It's about a bond that goes beyond life and death, a final act of defiance, and a twist that will leave you breathless. What will happen when the dog, alone and forsaken, finds its way into the most unimaginable of situations? Hold tight, because the twist of this tale will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty, revenge, and the last chance for redemption. Now, let's take you back to that fateful night. The rain came down in sheets, drenching everything in its path. The street was desolate, the kind of place where even the faintest sounds seemed to disappear into the night. Streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement, their glow barely strong enough to break the heavy darkness that wrapped around the quiet neighborhood. The wind howled through the alleyways, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. As the dog limped down the empty road, its paws leaving small, wet prints behind, the world felt cold and indifferent. The houses, with their darkened windows, seemed like silent sentinels, watching but never intervening. Each step the dog took echoed in the silence, the soft thud of its frail body against the ground marking its lonely journey. The dog's breath came in shallow gasps, its old joints aching with every movement. It could feel the sharp sting of betrayal deep in its heart. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, as if something was lurking just beyond its sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustling sound in the bushes seemed to grow louder, as if the night itself was alive with whispers. The dog's instincts screamed at it to turn back, but it pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency, a strange pull that it couldn't explain. The darkness ahead felt like an invitation, one that it couldn't ignore. What lay ahead? Was it the end of its journey, or was it something more terrifying? The answers seemed just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. The dog's name was Rufus. In his prime, he was a powerful and loyal German shepherd, with a sleek coat of black and tan fur that glistened in the sun. His eyes, once bright and sharp, had dulled with age, now clouded with cataracts that made it difficult to see clearly. He was no longer the fearless protector he once was, but he still carried the weight of a lifetime spent guarding and loving. Rufus had been there through every moment, from the long, exhausting days of training to the quiet nights at home, curled up by his owner's feet. But now, Rufus was a shadow of the dog he used to be. His bones creaked with every step, and his once powerful legs now stumbled with the weight of his years. He had been with his owner, Ben, for nearly 12 years. Ben had been his whole world, the one person he trusted more than anyone else. They shared a bond that few would understand, a bond built on loyalty, trust, and the quiet comfort of being together. But now, that bond had been shattered in a single heartless moment. Ben, a man in his mid-30s, had always been distant. His moods were as unpredictable as the weather, swinging from warmth to coldness in an instant. Rufus had always been there, by his side, loyal no matter what. But in recent months, something had changed. Ben's temper had grown darker, his patience thinner, until one day, something broke. Rufus was no longer the young dog he had once been. His joints ached, and his once sharp senses were now dull. Ben had grown tired of him, fed up with his aging companion, and the bond they once shared became something he could no longer bear. That night, When Ben had shoved Rufus out of the car and onto the wet street, it was the culmination of years of emotional strain. Rufus had tried to understand, tried to please Ben in every way he could, but the love he had given was no longer returned. As the car disappeared into the night, leaving him in the rain, Rufus felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not just from the abandonment, but from the realization that the person he trusted most had turned his back on him. In that moment, Rufus didn't know where to go or what to do. He only knew one thing: he couldn't give up. His instincts, buried deep within his aging body, told him to keep moving, to find a way to survive. He had been a protector his whole life, and now it was his turn to fight for himself. But as Rufus limped forward, the weight of betrayal pressed heavily on him. He couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at him. Was he truly alone in this world now? Was there no one left to care for him? Every instinct screamed to return to Ben, but the man's cold disregard made it impossible. Rufus didn't just fear for his life. He feared what lay ahead in a world that had become as cold and unforgiving as his once loving owner. The night stretched on, each hour bleeding into the next as Rufus limped down the darkened street, his mind spinning with thoughts of abandonment and confusion. His once sharp instincts were clouded by pain and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He had given Ben his all. He had served him faithfully, protecting him from danger, keeping him company during sleepless nights, and offering unconditional love when no one else would. But now, as the rain soaked through his fur and the cold gnawed at his bones, Rufus couldn't help but wonder if all of it had been for nothing. The road ahead seemed endless, and the streetlights provided little comfort, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. There was no sign of life, just the distant hum of cars speeding by and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Rufus's body ached, and he could feel his strength dwindling with each step. His paws were raw, and he had long since lost the energy to keep up a steady pace. He stumbled to a stop, leaning against a nearby fence, panting heavily. A few minutes passed before Rufus gathered himself and began to walk again, albeit slowly. He didn't know where he was going, or if he had the strength to keep moving, but something in him refused to give in. He had faced worse, hadn't he? He had survived worse. But as he rounded a corner, a strange, almost unsettling sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. Footsteps. Rufus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of someone or something walking in the night made his fur bristle. Who could it be? He hadn't seen anyone for hours, and the road seemed deserted. The footsteps grew closer, and Rufus's instinct told him to hide. But where? He glanced around, eyes darting in search of shelter. That's when he saw it. A small alleyway just ahead. With a renewed burst of energy, he darted toward the shadows, hiding behind a dumpster, his heart racing in his chest. He strained his ears, trying to discern the direction of the footsteps. A figure emerged from the mist, shrouded in darkness, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry. Rufus's senses flared. The figure was tall, but he couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette against the weak streetlight. The figure paused near the dumpster, sniffing the air as if searching for something. For a moment, everything felt like it had frozen. Rufus's heart, the rain, the entire world. He held his breath, praying that the figure wouldn't spot him. But the man, for that's what Rufus could now make out from the figure's shape, didn't seem to notice. He continued walking, past the dumpster and down the street. As the footsteps faded into the distance, Rufus let out a sigh of relief. But he knew it wasn't over. Something about this night felt wrong, off in a way he couldn't explain. He waited a moment longer before emerging from his hiding spot, shaking the water from his fur. Despite the relief, a sense of dread lingered. He had to keep moving, had to find somewhere to rest, somewhere safe. His old body wasn't up to much more than walking, and his hunger was starting to gnaw at him too. He had no idea where he was going, but there was no turning back. As he stumbled forward, his thoughts kept drifting back to Ben. What had changed? What had driven the man to this cruelty? Rufus had given him everything, And yet, it hadn't been enough. The betrayal had cut deeper than anything he could have imagined, and each step forward was filled with anger and confusion. How could he have been so blind? But there was no time for questions now. Rufus had a new enemy to face. The city, with all its dangers and uncertainties. He had to find food, shelter, and safety. And, in the back of his mind, he knew that the only way to survive in a world that had cast him aside was to trust no one. But as he continued on, something strange happened. He felt a shift, a pull, something subtle yet undeniable. The street began to change. The surroundings became more eerie, as if he were walking into an entirely different world. The houses grew older, the shadows deeper, and the air grew colder. Rufus hesitated as he approached an overgrown yard with a dilapidated house looming behind a rusted iron gate. The house was silent, its windows dark and lifeless, but there was something about it that called to him, something that felt strangely familiar. He slowly made his way inside the yard, pawing at the gate, which creaked open with a soft groan. The sense of foreboding deepened as he crossed the threshold into the yard. The smell of decay and something sweeter, like incense, filled the air. Was it a memory, or was something truly strange at work here? The pull was stronger now, urging him forward, and Rufus couldn't ignore it. He moved deeper into the yard, driven by an unknown force, all the while wondering if this place would bring him salvation, or something far worse. As he entered the house, the door creaked shut behind him, sealing off any chance of retreat. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, Rufus's last shred of doubt vanished. The world outside no longer mattered. Whatever was inside this house would be the final test of his will to survive. The house was as silent as a tomb, the kind of silence that presses down on you, filling every corner with an oppressive weight. Rufus moved cautiously, his paws barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floors. The air inside felt damp, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you weren't alone, even when there was no one in sight. As Rufus ventured deeper into the house, his every sense was on high alert. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the faint scent of decay seemed to grow stronger. A cold draft seeped in from somewhere, causing the fur on the back of his neck to stand on end. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There were old paintings hanging crookedly on the walls, their faces distorted with time. The furniture was covered in layers of dust, some pieces missing parts, as though they had been abandoned in a hurry. Something about the house felt wrong. It wasn't just the physical decay. There was a palpable sense of unease that hung in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rufus's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something kept him moving forward, something deep inside that refused to give up. A sudden noise cut through the silence, a faint scratching coming from upstairs. Rufus's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his body stiff with tension, his ears straining to catch any further sound. The scratching continued, slow and methodical, as though something or someone was moving in the attic. He backed up, his tail tucked low, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence returned, but it was even heavier now, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Rufus's instincts told him to run, to leave before whatever was in that attic noticed him. But there was a part of him, the part that had been betrayed by Ben, the part that had been cast aside, that wanted to push forward. He wasn't sure if it was anger or something deeper, something primal, but he moved toward the stairs. With each step, the creaking of the old house grew louder, more unsettling. The stairs were narrow, steep, and nearly rotted in places. Rufus's paw hit a loose board, and it gave way with a loud crack. He winced, but the sound didn't seem to provoke any reaction from the house. No creaking floorboards or eerie whispers. Everything seemed still. He reached the top of the stairs, his muscles tense, his eyes scanning the dark hallway before him. There were more rooms, closed doors on either side. The scratching noise had stopped, but something told him that whatever was in the attic hadn't gone away. It was still there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, A soft whispering echoed through the house, so faint that it could have been a trick of the wind. Rufus's hackles rose, and he instinctively shrank back. The whispering was unintelligible, but it sounded like a voice from the past. His mind flickered to memories of Ben, how he had once called his name so lovingly, the way his hands had petted him, soothing him in moments of distress. But then came the memory of the cruel moment when Ben had tossed him aside like an old toy, abandoned in a place that seemed so eerily similar to this one. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, holding secrets Rufus wasn't meant to hear. He could almost make out a word. Help, it seemed to say. Help me. Rufus's breath caught in his throat. The voice, it sounded like Ben. But it couldn't be. He had left him, abandoned him. Rufus had been dumped on the side of the road like an old, unwanted thing. The idea that Ben could be trapped in this house, or worse, that this house could be holding a part of him, sounded impossible, yet the voice seemed to call out to him. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the air growing colder. He glanced around, disoriented. The faint light from the street barely filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows that danced and flickered with every creak of the house. It felt like the house was breathing, slowly, steadily, as though it were alive and watching him. Rufus's pulse quickened as he followed the sound of the whispering. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led somewhere. Each step he took felt like he was walking deeper into a trap, but he couldn't stop himself. Something was pulling him forward, a force beyond his control. The whispering stopped, and a new sound filled the air. A slow, deliberate scratching from the attic again. But this time, it was accompanied by the soft sound of something else. Footsteps, faint at first but growing louder. Someone, or something, was coming down from the attic. Rufus's heart raced, his body frozen in place. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but his legs refused to move. The steps grew louder, closer. The faint outline of a figure appeared at the top of the stairs, just beyond his line of sight. Rufus's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly descended. The darkness seemed to wrap around the figure, making it hard to distinguish any details. The figure stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then the voice came again, clear and unmistakable, calling out from the shadows. You're not alone, Rufus. You've never been alone. Rufus's heart pounded in his chest as the figure at the top of the stairs seemed to pause, watching him from the shadows. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of impending danger hanging in the room. His breath came in shallow gasps as the figure took one slow step after another, descending the stairs. Each step creaked under the weight of something ancient, something that seemed to know more than it should. Rufus. The voice called again, softer this time, yet its resonance made the hairs on his neck stand on end. There was no mistaking it now. It was Ben's voice, twisted and wrong, as if it had been altered by the darkness of the house itself. Rufus's paws trembled, his legs locked in place. He couldn't move. He didn't want to move. The figure emerged from the shadows, and Rufus's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Ben, not exactly. The person in front of him looked like Ben, but the features were distorted, as if a mask had been placed over his face, a mask of death. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and empty, the color long drained from them. His once familiar voice now carried a chilling undertone, a sound born of pain, betrayal, and something darker still. Ben? Rufus's voice cracked, a mixture of confusion and sorrow filling him. He had hoped for so long to see the one person who had cared for him, but now, standing before him was something far worse than he could have imagined. Ben, what happened to you? Rufus asked, his voice trembling. His body quaked, but a surge of anger rose in his chest, as though the helplessness he had felt all those months finally found a voice. The figure before him, Ben or what remained of him, smiled. It was a twisted grin, barely recognizable, stretching across a face that had no warmth, no humanity left. You shouldn't have come here, Rufus. You're just like them. Abandoned, forgotten, left to die. The words felt like a slap, each syllable seeping into Rufus's mind like poison. For a moment, the house around them seemed to respond. The walls groaned, as if they too were in pain. The floor beneath Rufus's paws buckled slightly, a soft tremor running through the structure. He could feel it now. He wasn't just in a house. He was in the belly of something ancient, something that thrived on abandonment, betrayal, and broken souls. It was feeding off his fear, just as it had fed off Ben's. Rufus shook his head, fighting against the rising dread that tried to swallow him whole. "You left me. You left me alone," he whispered, more to himself than to the twisted image of Ben before him. "You didn't care. You didn't even look back." Ben's face twisted in anger, the distorted mask of his features contorting further. "You think I wanted to leave you? You think I didn't care?" His voice rose, the anger in it unsettling. "You're a dog, a thing. You're nothing without me, just like everyone else." Discarded. Rufus's chest tightened as the words struck deep, but a spark of defiance ignited within him. "No, I'm more than that. I'm not just a thing for you to use and throw away. I was loyal to you. But you," the words caught in his throat, but his resolve grew stronger. "You betrayed me. You betrayed everything we had." Ben's mask-like smile flickered for a moment. Something in his hollow eyes seemed to break, but only for a split second. The shadow of the house seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were listening, reacting to their exchange. The ground trembled again, this time more violently, as if the house itself was rejecting the emotions spilling out in the confrontation. The air shifted, the house's grip on the moment tightening. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment of anger dissipated. Rufus could feel something deep inside him, something primal, stirring to life. His muscles tensed, his instincts finally taking over. The betrayal he had suffered at Ben's hands was no longer his burden alone to bear. This house, this twisted, suffocating place, had fed on that pain for too long. With a sudden surge of strength, Rufus lunged forward, his teeth bared as he faced the twisted figure of Ben. The house seemed to close in around them, its suffocating presence intensifying. But Rufus wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't going to let this darkness claim him. Ben, if it was even Ben, let out a horrible, distorted scream as Rufus closed the distance between them. But before they could collide, a force unseen took hold of the creature, dragging it back into the shadows of the attic, pulling it away with an inhuman strength. Ben's scream echoed through the walls, fading as quickly as it had come. Rufus stood there, panting, his mind racing as the silence fell over the house once again. The walls seemed to settle, the oppressive weight in the air dissipating, as though the house itself had exhaled. The grip of fear that had suffocated him now loosened, replaced by a sense of clarity. He had faced his fears, confronted the very thing that had tormented him, and now it was over. The house that had held him captive, both physically and emotionally, had released its hold. But as Rufus stood in the stillness, he couldn't help but wonder, what had really happened to Ben? What was this place and what had it wanted from him? The answers would remain unanswered for now, lost to the shadows of a past that would never fully fade. But Rufus had won. The house would never hold him again. And as he stepped toward the door, the first rays of dawn filtering through the cracks, he felt the weight of a long-buried truth lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore, not truly. He had fought, and in the end, he had claimed his freedom. The past had been cruel, but the future was his to decide. As Rufus stepped into the early light of dawn, the oppressive darkness of the house receded behind him. The world outside felt different, brighter, almost as though the air itself had been cleared of something heavy. He could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirp of birds waking up to a new day. It was a world that seemed far away from the suffocating grip of the house he had just escaped. But as he stood there, taking in the quiet morning, a flood of emotions washed over him. The fight, the fear, and the darkness of the past had all led him here, back into the light. The journey he had gone through, the betrayal and abandonment, were no longer weights around his neck. Instead, they were lessons Lessons about the power of loyalty, the cost of silence, and the strength that comes from standing up for oneself. Rufus had been discarded, forgotten, but in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. The house, the twisted figure of Ben, and the torment he had faced were all symbols of abandonment. The deep fear of being unloved, of being left behind. But he wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a thing. Rufus had learned to fight for his own survival, to find the strength within himself when the world seemed to have turned its back on him. It was over now, but the scars of the journey would remain, marking the pages of his story. What had happened to Ben, to the house? Those answers weren't as important as the one Rufus had found within himself. He wasn't broken. He was whole. And in that moment, Rufus understood the most important lesson of all. Even when everything around you falls apart, you have the power to rebuild. What would happen next? That was for him to decide. The future was his now. What do you think will happen next in Rufus's journey? Will he seek justice? Or will the darkness continue to haunt him? Share your theories and predictions in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another spine-chilling tale. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Join our community for more thrilling stories, and stay tuned for the twists and turns we've got in store. Your next adventure is just a click away.